Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
All right. Is the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, run by violent anti-Semites? I asked this question, or I should say my guest today on the show is going to be asking this question and answering it in his way, and that's going to be Dr. Francisco Gil White. He's always stimulating when he comes on. We often butt heads together. I think maybe on this topic we might be agreeing a lot, but we'll be talking about that. And you are invited to call into the show if you have any comments or questions, and only if you're listening live. That means if you're listening on Tuesday morning between 7 to 8 a.m. Holy Time right here in the land of Israel, or if it's between midnight to 1 a.m. Monday night U.S. Eastern Time. That means that we are live, and you can call into the show. Our numbers are on the top of our homepage at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. All right. I have another minute and a half until the segment is over. And I'm always like racing, in this 3-minute period where I introduce the show. And I really want to take time out to acknowledge you, the listeners, from all over the world, and especially those who support the station, because it costs a lot of money to be able to keep a radio station going. And it's only because of your input and your support and your donations that we're able to continue. So let me just read off just a few of the names of the people who have donated, who, by the way, when you do donate, you get a medallion with your name on it put up on our wall of fame. Go to our website at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com, IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com, and check out our wall of fame. You're going to see names like Kenneth Lambert, Chris Cartwright, some people donate anonymously, Rusty B. and Connie B., Harvest Weekly, Thomas Rawls, Brian Pearson, Terrence Grants, John and Etta Mae Grooms, Gwendolyn Barker, Mark Kearley, Brenda Uch. These are real people. These are not just names like saying Debbie and Paul. Bradley Bailey, Madge Roberts, Jean G. and Patricia G. Todd M., Linda Lemming, Yechiel Stein, Lori Adler, etc. Thank you so much. We'll be right back.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
All right, we're back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. And the main question we're asking today is the ICC, or the International Criminal Court, run by violent anti-Semites? And we're asking this question because, well, one of the reasons is because they always seem to be picking on Israel. There are so many countries who are really perpetrating war crimes, and yet Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, the one that is known for having the most moral army in the world, we are the ones that are always in the targets of the ICC. That's what it seems like. Our guest is Dr. Francisco Gil White. He's a political anthropologist and professor at Etam University in Mexico City. He's also known for his extensive research, which examines what's driving world politics, movements, and agendas. And you can check out his website at www.his HIRHome.com. That's HIR home for historical and investigative research. www.hirhome.com. Welcome to the show, Professor Francisco Gil White.
Thank you for having me, Tamar. It's always a pleasure to be on your show.
And always a pleasure to have you on. Go ahead.
I want to tell your listeners that tomorrow we will be publishing on historical and investigative research, HIRHome.com, a full-fledged analysis of what the Icc has been doing with respect to Israel. So some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today will be included in that piece, and a lot more that your listeners may be interested in.
Okay, very good. Where would you like to start?
Well, I would like to start with some aspects of the ICC's ruling that are not usually discussed. And they have to do with the context of the ruling and the reasoning of the court. So, first of all, the question on the table is the ICC run by violent anti-Semites? And I think the first thing to consider here is the absurdity of the PLO Fatah, which now calls itself the Palestinian Authority. But of course, it's good to always to remember that when we say Palestinian Authority, we're talking about PLO Fatah. And why is it important to remember that? And this is the first piece of context that matters here. Because Fatah is the organization that was created by Haj Amin al-Husseini. And Haj Amin al-Husseini was one of the important leaders of the German Nazi final solution. So Fatah is linked at the origin to the extermination of the European Jews by the German Nazis. It's not a detail. It is not a cosmetic, embarrassing aspect. It is not a piece of history that has been superseded. None of that is true. Haj Amin al-Husseini was, till the day he died, a violent anti-Semite whose mission was to exterminate Jews everywhere. When he arrived in Berlin in 1941, the fall of 1941, he had a very important meeting with Hitler where they agreed that they would work together to exterminate the Jews in what is now the state of Israel. That didn't work out because the German Nazis were stopped at El Alamein in Egypt and couldn't advance from there. But Husseini got a consolation prize. He was invited by the German Nazis to join in the program to exterminate the European Jews, and he joyfully accepted. Forgive me, Tamar, I have a little bit of reflux. He joyfully accepted and immediately began creating for the Nazis propaganda directed at the Arabs that invited the Arabs to kill Jews wherever they could find them. He also organized SS divisions for Heinrich Himmler that participated in the Holocaust. And according to the Nuremberg testimony of Dieter Wislicenny, who was Adolf Eichmann's right-hand man, remember Adolf Eichmann is the recognized director of the death camp system. This Dieter Wislicenny, his right-hand man, testified at Nuremberg that Husseini had participated as a partner and co-director of the death camp system with Adolf Eichmann. So Husseini is not just anyone. He is a man who arguably has an equal responsibility with Adolf Eichmann in the destruction of the European Jews. And this is the creator of Al-Fatah, which is the organ that Arafat led from the beginning until his death. And both Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas were handpicked by Husseini to lead Al-Fatah. Al-Fatah swallowed the PLO in around 1968, and after that kept its name. So the PLO is basically Al-Fatah, And that's what the Palestinian Authority is. Now, with that background, and considering that PLO Fatah has always been directing terrorism against innocent Israelis, because we know that more than one Palestinian terror group is actually part of Fatah and has been operating even after the peace process began, even after the Oslo Accords were signed. Some of these Palestinian terror groups, which are part of Fatah, have been operating from the Palestinian Authority's own budget. For example, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, which has recently changed its name, I forget what the new name is, but the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades is by far the most violent of all Palestinian terror groups, and they are part of Fatah, operating from the Palestinian Authority's own budget. So, why would PLO Fatah, or if you wish, the Palestinian Authority, solicit admission to the International Criminal Court? That's an absurdity, because the International Criminal Court was officially created to prosecute war crimes that are committed in or by their member states, right? So if the Palestinian Authority requests admission to the ICC, what that normally means is that the Palestinian Authority falls under the jurisdiction of the ICC, and therefore the ICC can prosecute the war crimes that the Palestinian Authority is constantly committing. Right. So why would the Palestinian Authority request admission to the International Criminal Court unless it was quite sure already that the International Criminal Court is run by violent anti-Semites? Because that is the only condition under which it would make any sense for the Palestinian leaders to request admission to the ICC. Unless the ICC is run by violent anti-Semites, they would be exposing themselves to be investigated and prosecuted by the ICC. So that's the first point.
What legitimacy does the ICC have? Because Russia doesn't recognize it. The United States doesn't recognize it. Israel doesn't recognize it. There's another few countries, major countries as well, that don't. So what strength do they really have?
Okay, so the ICC is a club. The ICC only has jurisdiction in the territories of those countries that have signed the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute is the founding and governing document of the International Criminal Court. So the court is a club. If you, as a state, sign the Rome Statute and join the ICC, you fall under the ICC's jurisdiction. But it is the state that grants the ICC jurisdiction in its own territory. So the ICC only has jurisdiction in the territories of signatory states. Is that clear?
Keep going, because there are many Israelis that are afraid to travel overseas, that they could possibly, God forbid, be arrested as a war criminal who just served in the IDF.
Well, right. So this is why the ruling of the ICC is so worrisome, because once the ICC declares that it has jurisdiction to investigate war crimes, alleged war crimes supposedly committed by Israel, it can recruit the police forces of other states, of its member states, to try to arrest the people that the ICC considers that it's investigating and prosecuting. So, they should be worried. Now, but the question is, what is this circus about, right? So the first point is, why would PLO Fatah, or the Palestinian Authority, request admission to the ICC unless it was quite sure that the people running the ICC are violent anti-Semites? Now, what made the Palestinian leaders think that? I have a hypothesis. The chief prosecutor of the ICC is a judge by the name Fatou Bensouda.
Okay, you know what? Hold on to that thought. We'll talk about it more when we get back from the break. Don't go anywhere, everybody. And remember, you can call in with any comments or questions on this topic. We'll be right back.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
We are back here at the Tamar Yonah Show here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. And we're talking about the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which, by the way, is not recognized by the United States, by Russia, by Israel, by other countries as well. Yet they seem to always be targeting Israel. And you would think it would be maybe North Korea, Iran, which sponsors terrorism, even the Palestinian Authority, which is run by the PLO Fatah, as our guest Professor Francisco Gil-White says. And you would think that the PLO would be more afraid of the ICC since they harbor terrorists, they produce them, they encourage terrorism against Israel, and their leader, Mahmoud Abbas, was number 2 for the arch-terrorist of the world, which was Yasser Arafat, and you would think that they would be afraid themselves, that they would be investigated, and yet they're very confident that Israel is the one that's going to be targeted. So maybe you can answer that question, Professor Francisco Gil-White.
Okay, so why are they so confident that the court is going to be nice to them and mean to Israel? It's important to remember that the leaders of the Palestinian movement are jihadis. Now, this is something that lots of people don't understand. I mean, they do believe this about the Hamas, because Hamas has always been loudly, explicitly, publicly jihadi, and very proudly. But there has been a media barrage supported by many academics that has tried to convince people that PLO Fatah is a secular and even leftist organization. But of course, once you know the history, you can see what's really going on, because Fatah was created by Haj Amin al-Husseini. And Haj Amin al-Husseini was the most important jihadi leader of the first half of the 20th century. So you wouldn't expect the most important jihadi leader of the 20th century to create a secular organization. Of course not. Of course, Fatah has at its core a jihadi mission. And of course, jihadists are not leftists. Jihadis are extreme right-wingers. Just look at Iran, right? Everything about a jihadi theocratic organization or state is in the far, 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 far right where the Nazis are, right? This is why we call them Islamofascists, because they're in the same political corner. Whether some of them are theocratic and some of them are secular, so the Nazis are secular, the Iranian jihadis are theocratic, but they're all together in the very, very, very extreme far right. So that's the truth of what PLO Fatah is. And once you understand that, and once you take into account how jihadis see the world, you can begin to form a hypothesis for why they're so confident. Because you see, for a jihadi, the only thing that exists is Islam and Islam's final victory over the Jews, right? These guys are mono-obsessed. And if you see the world like that, and if you believe that every good quote unquote Muslim will have to agree with you, then when you look at the biographical details of the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, you can see how these people process that. Because the chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, as I find when I looked into her background, says here, Fatou Bensouda grew in Banjul, Bathurst, Gambia, in a polygamous Muslim family of more than a dozen children. Okay, so if you're a jihadi and you read that Fatou Bensouda grew up in a polygamous Muslim family, what you hear is that she is a very Orthodox Muslim. Okay, because only very Orthodox Muslims live in polygamous families. All right? Now, if you believe she is an Orthodox Muslim and you are a leader of the Palestinian movement, you think to yourself, oh, we're going to be safe there because an Orthodox Muslim is going to be on our side. An Orthodox Muslim is going to be an anti-Semite like me. That's how they think. This hypothesis agrees with the chronology because, in fact, the Palestinian Authority waited until after Bensouda became chief prosecutor, which happened in 2012, to request admission to the ICC. That request happened in 2015. Now, without this hypothesis, as we said, it is inexplicable that PLO Fatah would even want to join the ICC, because, as you pointed out, the raison d'etre, the official raison d'etre of the ICC is to investigate war crimes, and the specialty of PLO Fatah is to produce war crimes, right? Now, it is unlikely that the Palestinian leaders will change their opinion about the ideological tenor of the International Criminal Court, because the man who will soon replace Fatou Bensouda as ICC chief prosecutor is Karim A.A. Khan, who, and I quote, has taken a second wife in the past few years, unquote, meaning he is also a polygamous Muslim, and, quote, is the son-in-law of the fourth caliph of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, unquote.
Interesting.
So the Palestinian leaders are unlikely to see their confidence shaken in the violent anti-Semitism that they presume rules the International Criminal Court. Now the question is this obvious opinion of the Palestinian leaders correct? Right? And to investigate that, what we need to do is look at the way in which the International Criminal Court decided to include the Palestinian Authority as a state party to the ICC. And when we look at that, what we find is that they basically disregarded every single aspect of international law. Every single precedent, every single jurisprudence, every single treaty governing the relations between states, and even the jurisprudence of the International Criminal Court itself. This was all pointed out by Judge Peter Kovac. Judge Peter Kovac happens to be a judge of the International Criminal Court, and he presided the chamber that was impaneled by the chief prosecutor to answer her petition to decide the question of territorial jurisdiction in the quote-unquote state of Palestine. So he presided that chamber. It was a chamber composed of only 3 judges. And the ruling that everybody's been talking about, it was written by the other 2 judges. We got 2 out of 3 judges agreeing with the chief prosecutor, because in her petition, she made it very clear that she thought that the Palestinian Authority is governing a state and that the boundaries of the state are the territories of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, etc. So she made it very clear, although, of course, she was seeking clarification, right? This is the pretense in the petition. So 2 of the 3 judges that had to write this clarification agreed with her, but the 3rd judge, Judge Peter Kovac, disagreed, and he disagreed vehemently. He wrote a 163-page rebuttal of the majority, which is in fact a refutation of the majority. He went into great detail, analyzed every single thing the other two judges said. And, you know, Tamar, legal language is usually very dry, but Kovach's is the exception. This guy chastises his two colleagues for their, quote, acrobatics with provisions of the Rome Statute that cannot mask legal reality, unquote, and for, quote, the majority's deliberate refusal to take into consideration relevant rules of international law, unquote. I could go into detail into everything that Judge Peter Kovach made fun of, because he made fun of it, of what the other two judges, of the acrobatics of the other two judges in order to say that, you know, the Palestinian Authority is supposedly governing a state. But I'm going to focus just on the most important pieces of information. The first one is that according to international law, and let me quote here an international law expert who is speaking about this matter. He says that it is, I'm not quoting, I'm paraphrasing, even a body such as the UN cannot simply take territory from one state and give it to another, okay? The host, what he calls the host state, has to agree. So here's exactly what it said. Now I'm quoting verbatim. Quote, recognition of a new state essentially means legally recognizing the transfer of sovereignty over a territory from one authority to another. An international body, including the UN, cannot just take away territory without the permission of the original host state. To do so would be a violation of one of the defining rules of the system of states, unquote. So what this means is that these international bodies, even if it were the UN, because you could argue the UN is the right place to even discuss this, not the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is not competent to say who is a state and who is not a state. Obviously,
right.
That is not the ICC's charter. Okay, so, but even if we were talking about the UN, even the UN cannot simply take the territory of one state and give it to another.
Okay, hold that thought because we have to go for another break. When we get back, we're going to wrap everything up and find out what Israel could do or should do. We'll be right back, everybody. Don't go anywhere.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Bentako, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany is but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
All right, we are back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com, and our guest is Professor Francisco Gil White. He's asking and answering the question, is the ICC, or the International Criminal Court, which always seems to pick on Israel, are they run by violent anti-Semites? And in the last segment, you were talking, explaining who was at the head, etc., and you were telling me during the break, Professor, that you have a neutron bomb to really share with our listeners. So tell us about that.
All right. Well, let me just close the point I was making. So The territories of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza cannot be a state until Israel recognizes. That's the point that I was making, that even the UN cannot simply take a territory and give it to another state. Judea, Samaria, and Gaza will not be a state until Israel recognizes. Now, what does that mean? It means that the Palestinian Authority could not be a state when it was included in the International Criminal Court in 2015, because Israel, to this day, has not recognized it as a state. And that means that the inclusion of the Palestinian Authority as a state party to the ICC in 2015 was illegal, which makes moot the entire discussion that the ICC recently had about what its jurisdiction is. Okay? Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to make that point. The entire thing is moot.
Okay.
Now, Judge Peter Kovac was meticulous in pointing out everything that the court disregarded, that the majority opinion disregarded in terms of international law, in order to get this ruling going where the ICC has jurisdiction over what it calls the state of Palestine. But Kovac left one thing out, and this is never discussed, which is that there are several precedents of international law where the representatives, the recognized representatives of the Palestinians, have rejected the territories of Judea and Samaria and Gaza for a Palestinian state. It happened in 1947 when Haj Amin al-Husseini's Arab Higher Committee, which was the representative of the Arab Palestinians, rejected the offer of a Palestinian state in territories that included Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. It happened, and it happened in 1964, when the PLO, the recognized representative of the Arab Palestinians, stated in its founding charter, in its 1964 founding charter, explicitly that the territories of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, although it didn't call it that, it called it the West Bank, right? It always says West Bank when it talks about Judea and Samaria, but it said that the West Bank and Gaza were not part of Palestine. This is the founding constitution of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the recognized sole representative of the Arab Palestinians, stated in its founding charter that the territories of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza are not Palestinian. And if anything makes the case that a Palestinian state can never exist on the territories of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, so long as Israel, the sovereign state, has not recognized such a state, it is this. It is this simple fact that the representatives of the Arab Palestinians said explicitly in their founding constitution that these territories are not Palestine. Now, you will, of course, ask me, how is it possible that the representatives of the Arab Palestinians could have possibly said explicitly in their founding constitution that Judea, Samaria, and Gaza are not part of Palestine?
Right. How?
The answer is very simple. In 1964, when that charter was written, Jordan was illegally occupying Judea and Samaria, and Egypt was illegally occupying Gaza. Why were these occupations illegal? Because they had gained control over those territories by launching a war of genocidal aggression.
Right.
Okay? Right. So it was announced by Azam Pasha as a war to produce genocide. That's what it was. And any war of aggression that captures territory is occupying territory. That goes double if the war is a genocidal war of aggression. So those occupations were illegal, but they were doubly illegal well, let's just put it this way: they were occupying territories that couldn't possibly belong to them because they had been offered for a Palestinian state. The representatives of the Palestinians, Haj Amin al-Husseini and the Arab Higher Committee, had said, we don't want it, right? We want to exterminate the Jews, right? So those territories were in legal limbo when Egypt and Jordan illegally occupied them in a war of genocidal aggression. Now, they used those territories to launch another war of genocidal aggression, which is the War of 1967. And when they lost those territories, in fact, those territories were liberated by Israel because the previous international law precedent was the San Remo Conference, which had included those territories for the Jewish homeland that the British committed themselves to helping create in British Mandate Palestine. And even when Winston Churchill, in his white paper, later lopped off all of Transjordan from the Palestine Mandate and forbade settlement of Jews in what is today Jordan, right? Jordan is, of course, the first Palestinian state. There's already one. Even after Winston Churchill did that, the territory that remained for the Jewish homeland was the West Bank. The text of the Churchill White Paper says that where Jews may settle is the territory of Palestine that lies west of the River Jordan. So both precedents, the Conference of San Remo and even Winston Churchill's much reduced Palestine, both included Judea, Samaria, and Gaza
as part of Israel.
Territories where Jews could settle.
Okay,
now,
we have 3 minutes till the end of the show.
That's fine. I'm done. So those are the territories that Haj Amin al-Husseini rejected, and those are the territories that PLO Fatah then explicitly said are not part of Palestine. So who owns them? Obviously, the only legitimate sovereign of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza is the state of Israel. This is clear under international law. And the International Criminal Court has seen fit to ignore all international law in order to declare that the Palestinian Authority is governing a quote-unquote state of Palestine, that state of Palestine can be a party to the International Criminal Court, that the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, because according to the ICC, those are the territories of the state of Palestine. And finally, it has ruled that it can investigate Israel for supposed crimes of war because it has jurisdiction in Palestine, which is illogical, even if we granted all of the other nonsense that the ICC has ruled, because Israel is not a signatory to the Rome Statute and therefore cannot be considered as being part of the ICC's jurisdiction under any argument. So anyway, I find it very interesting that the court behaves this way, and the behavior of the court does seem to conform to the hypothesis that the Palestinian leaders have of the court. The court does behave the way violent anti-Semites who mean to persecute Israel and give a pass to an organization created by a top leader of the German Nazi final solution that does commit war crimes, right? Mm-hmm. So if the court means to do both those things, to persecute the refuge for persecuted Jews, and to give a pass to the heirs of the German Nazi final solution, well, it does seem like the court might be run by violent anti-Semites.
So what would you, in the last 60 seconds that we have, what would you suggest Israel do, respond, their reaction?
Well, I mean, the government of Israel should have been doing a million things that it has never done, that I've been yelling for them to do for years. So, I mean, it could do any number of things. It could explain the origins of PLO Fatah and the German Nazi final solution. It could use the resources of the Israeli state to make Haj Amin al-Husseini famous and put all of the documentation online for people to examine. For example, the Tablet just published an article that we can talk about this in another show, where photos have surfaced of Haj Amin al-Husseini touring the death camps. For years, people had denied this, because this is one of the things that Dieter Wislicenny said in his Nuremberg testimony. He said that Husseini had toured the death camps to supervise their functioning. Everybody said, no, that's a lie. This is libel, blah, blah, blah. Husseini never did that. Now we have photographs of Haj Amin al-Husseini touring the death camps. Of course he was there. So we could make that famous, right? The Israeli government could make that famous. And the Israeli government could make famous that PLO Fatah renounced the territories of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza in its founding charter.
Well, you know what? You have my vote for defense minister here. All right, we have to end it there. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show, Professor Francisco Gil-White. You visit his homepage at www.hearhome.com, HIRhome.com. Thank you so much for being with us.
Pleasure, Tamar.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.